evening, everyone. First of all, I'll introduce myself. Some of you actually know me, which I was a bit surprised about. I thought I was going to be a bit of a stranger here. My name is Greg Farrow. I've been in the industry for about 15 years now. And if this goes well, then it's obviously down to my own natural talents. But if this goes badly, then James actually gave me this job. So it's all his fault. But I've done all sorts of things. I've been a tester, I've been head of delivery, principal engineer, I've worked in architecture, and a few other things in and amongst that as well. But my current role is engineering practice lead at Cinch. So tonight I want to talk about how to build the right thing and how to do that quickly using domain-driven design. But DDD, there's a lot of theory. There are many books, lots of blog posts. I don't know about anybody else, I find that quite overwhelming. So I wanted to try and share with you some little tips that I've picked up along the way about how to apply it. Essentially, it's three things. So have faith in the process. Like DDD and event storming, it's a skill that you're going to learn. It's not something that I can just tell you tonight and tomorrow you can go in and nail it. It's something you've got to keep practicing at. So have faith in the process and you've got to keep going at it. Start small, like any big difficult thing. You're not going to solve it all in one go. So do little things. Start in a small way, start with simple things and build it up from there. And then finally, defend boundaries, which at this stage is a bit of a weird thing to say, but hopefully I'll explain that a little bit later on. Right, first thing to say then is when we're talking about domains, we're talking about discovery. We're not talking about designing things, we're talking about discovering things. So understanding the problem space. So try and keep that in mind while we go through. Let's get on with it. We're going to start with Conway's Law. So Conway's Law states that any organisation that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organisation's communication structure. Now, I don't know about you guys, that's a mouthful and I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means. So I've translated it into Greg speak, and I see this as being communication structure becomes architecture structure. So those communication lines become the architecture that ends up fulfilling the solution. In case you're interested, Mel Conway is actually a real guy. He's on Twitter, you can chat to him. There you go. So let's talk about an example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, not in any great specifics, but a little bit about buying second-hand cars. So I work for Cinch, it's kind of a bit of an interesting subject for us. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the finance part of the journey. So how does somebody who wants to buy a car, who doesn't have all the money up front, how do you go about getting a little bit of help with paying for that car? And we'll start with a little secret. So in this space, there are, I think, 8 different domains. So the team that started looking at this didn't know this, so this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but 8 domains. So when we started at Cinch, we had one team available to us, and we asked that team, go away and solve this car finance thing. Go for it. So what that really looks like is one squad of people, 8 different domains. So there's only one interactive part of this little talk, but how many microservices were built? So Cinch, just as a bit of a precursor, it's all microservices, all tiny little services running everywhere. So 8 domains to look after. How many microservices? More than 8?
At least 8.
At least 8. More than 8. Okay. 1 to 8?
Yeah.
Stop heckling. Okay.
One.
Yeah. So we're somewhere between more than 8 and 1, or one end at the extreme, the other. The answer is 1, so Bruno had a bit of insider knowledge there. So what we've got is a team who've been given a problem space and they've identified the solution space as being basically the same thing. And that's partly because given that one thing to look after, without techniques and tools to help you break that problem down, you really struggle to untangle that web of interconnectivity. So you end up with something that looks exactly like what you were given in the first place. Perfectly natural human way of trying to solve this issue. The trouble is that having all 8 domains in one place, in one big box, means you've got huge cognitive load in that team. Those guys have got to figure out, when they make one small change over here, this seemingly unrelated thing on the other side of the system could be affected. It's really difficult to reason about. You've got to hold all of that information in your head every time you make a change to that code base. And you end up with people a little bit unhappy. So in that situation, are you going to be working fast? Unlikely. Are you going to be working efficiently? Again, it's highly unlikely. Are you going to be a happy developer who enjoys coming to work every day? Increasingly less so, probably. And are you actually building the right thing? If you're spending all of your time trying to manage that cognitive load, you're not really focusing on, actually, what does this customer want us to build? So, coming back to Conway's Law, communication structure becomes architectural structure, and we can see in that example how that has happened. That's all well and good, but what is the right structure? And remember, I give you a bit of a spoiler there saying there were 8 different domains. Those guys didn't know that, so they didn't build that. So how do we find out what those domains look like? So DDD, domain-driven design, this should lead us to a more correct target architecture that's optimized for flow and is decoupled so that we can build things nice and quickly. But most people's reaction about hearing about DDD, especially if you've not well practiced at it, is something like this, where it's like, this is a big scary thing, there's so much sort of academic stuff there's so many books to read, how do I actually go about making sense of this? Some of you might have actually tried it, and as a result you've had a bit of a hard time, like you've had a go and it's not really worked and you've not been able to see any benefits from it because it's a long process. And truth be told, I'm in that camp as well. I've seen this done badly, I've done it badly, probably more than I've done it well. And unfortunately, I'm not an expert in this either, so I don't know tons about DDD. As I said, it's a skill, and I'm still very much learning this skill. But on the plus side, I have had some success with it. People I've worked with have had success with it, and that's what I want to try and share here. So let's talk about what worked for me. And for me, it's all really about event storming. When you're starting off with this stuff, forget about all of the other stuff and just focus on this one practice, this one discipline, because you can get so much value out of it with some fairly basic concepts. But before we get into that, we need to figure out what is a domain. So what are these things that we're trying to discover? And this can be a trip hazard. I think whenever you ask somebody this question, their answer invariably is different to the last person that you asked. It's a really difficult thing to pin down. So let's just say that a domain is an area of interest. It's a fuzzy thing, but it's a problem space. So we don't need to define it any more than that, really. You also hear things like subdomain, domain, subdomain. It's just an area of interest within another area of interest. But don't worry about it. I think the more, as I said, the more you use these techniques, the more you get into it, the more these things start to resolve themselves. You don't actually need to know in advance how all this works, because it will start to make sense as you work along. And remember, we're about discovering domains, we're not about designing them. So this is a completely different thing to drawing an architectural diagram. And we should start at a high level. So if we're working in an area and we think this might be a helpful technique to help us solve some problems, start with like a 10,000 foot view of that area, that problem space. And it's probably a good tip just to work a little bit on either side of that problem space as well, because what we're really looking to do here is find our boundaries. And the only way to find boundaries is to actually look a little bit on each side of those boundaries as well. So don't scope yourself too narrow to start with. For me, this whole thing is a cross-discipline process. Quite often, in my experience, it's been driven by engineers who would try and understand what it is they're meant to be building. But the reality is that this is just as important if you're a product owner or a BA or a QA or anybody, subject matter expert in that particular problem space as well. So make sure that you don't just have a bunch of engineers in a room trying to solve this problem. It really is a business technique, not an engineering technique. Right, so let's get on with some event storming. So we start off with orange post-it notes, and the colours are important. So orange post-it notes represent domain events. So written in past tense, And these are things that everybody in the room, and remember it's multidiscipline, everyone in the room should understand what these things mean. So you shouldn't be seeing things on here like stored object in S3 or red thing from Dynamo. Like that's not the right level. We should be seeing things on here that mean the same thing to a product owner or to a business analyst as they would do to an engineer. Where we start to run into trouble with this is an opportunity. What can happen with this is we end up in discussions and we'll be debating quite often language. What words are we using? Is that the right name for this thing? Or does that event actually happen? Or what is a domain event? And you can get lost in that quite easily. So use the pink post-it notes, the red post-it notes as hotspots to represent that. So if you've been talking around the same problem for 5 or 10 minutes, let's just write down on a pink post-it note, time box it, and we can put that away for later. And what you'll find is as you go through the rest of the process, you revisit this, and more often than not, you'll answer the question. And if not, by the time you got to the end of the process, that question will be much more fine-tuned and well thought out anyway. So you'll end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Here's one we prepared earlier. So it looks a bit of a mess, but we've got all of our different sort of domain events written up there. And now it's time to move on to commands. Quite often, commands are the yin to the event's yang. You'll end up with do this thing, and then the event is this thing happened. Like, that's fine. In most cases, that's what you'll have. Sometimes, though, you'll find corners where that doesn't quite make sense, and that's where these are really valuable, because in finding those corners and generating that extra conversation, you're actually learning a little bit more about this domain space, this problem space. So that's why these can be useful, even though on the face of it, quite often they're just like the same thing but in a different tense. So commands, present tense. Again, we're using hotspots to try and time box our conversations or highlight where we've got things that we're not so sure about. That's cool. And you'll see as well, we've moved some things around. So this is an organic process. You don't start with events, do events, and then move on to the next thing. You continue to evolve the things that you've been talking about right the way through the process. And that's good, because that is a result of you learning more about the domain. Next, we get to actors. So an actor is somebody or an entity that caused the command to occur. So this might be customer, or this might be supplier X, or this could be department within our own organisation. But adding these on again makes you think a little bit more carefully about the commands and the events. What you might find here is that you've written one down and you've got 2 actor stickers on it. Maybe that's fine, but in reality, could 2 different actors really be trying to do exactly the same thing? If they're both customers, maybe, but if one's a supplier and one's a customer, probably not. Probably it means that we need to explore that command event a little bit more. Maybe there's 2 there, so that can help you explore that a little bit better. And next, we get to policies, and this is where a little bit of sort of logic can come in. So you can see in this example, we reckon we've got 2 different events over here, and both of them need to happen before this command gets issued over on the right hand side. So in this case, we'll use a pink post-it note just to write down what that logic is. It's either or this is both have to happen before it moves on. And I think organically, when you're doing this process, you'll end up with lines drawn all over the place trying to describe things that are happening and dependencies. And when we get to this point, these policies can really make sense of those lines. And to just test what you've done so far, these domains, because we're discovering them, we're not defining them, they should mean exactly the same thing to our competitor. So whichever company you work for when you're doing this, if you think of who's your competitor and would they have written the same things on the same post-it notes, if the answer is yes, that's probably an indicator we're on the right track here and we're talking in the right language at the right level. If the answer is no, it's probably a bit of a warning sign there that, well, we're getting a little bit too into the implementation detail. What you find in doing this process is naturally you will start to group things together. So you'll have a whole bunch of events and you realise the language is very similar on some of these, or they all seem to pertain to a very similar part of the system, and you start to naturally group them together. And when you do that, as you get towards the end, you can actually start to draw boundaries around these things, and this is the really, really key part. So you're finding what those domains are. That's exactly what we're here to do. So those lines represent those different domains within your problem space. So you end up with something like this, and this is about 2 hours later on the same day. So we're able to put things together, draw a circle around them, and we can say, right, that's a domain, that's a domain, that's a domain. And if we neaten it up a little bit, this is what it might look like digitally. So it looks a bit less chaotic in this case. And the next step then is to repeat this process on a smaller scale. So if you remember, we started off our 10,000 foot view, our whole problem space, and what we've ended up with is a whole bunch of different circles drawn on the whiteboard. At a high level, we've been thinking at a high level, so the details are probably missing, and that's absolutely fine. But what we should do is come back to this and drill into it in more detail. So we want to look at one of those domains and really understand that much better so that we can build a really good solution for it. And in doing that, you end up with something like this. So on the face of it, it looks like we've got a similar number of events and commands and actors and all that kind of stuff. In reality, this is 1/8 of what I showed a couple of slides ago. So you can see, as we start to focus in on one domain, all the details start to come out. Bit of extra credit. So what I would say is that, from my experience, doing what we've done there is like the 80-20 rule. That'll get you so far in terms of value and common understanding of those problem spaces. But you can go a little bit further if you want to. Credit to Donald Spring for this, but these are all the different kind of types of ticket you can put on your event storming. So we've talked about events, then adding on commands and our actors, then talking about policies. And for me, that pretty much covers most use cases. But as you start to hone your craft and get good at doing this and get more experience at doing this, you start to spot, actually, there's something that happens between this command and this event. We've got some sort of system that makes a decision here, or we've got some sort of aggregation going on. So I would say, I wanted to put this up because I think this is important as a place to move forward to, but you don't need to know all this stuff. Even if all you did was events, you'll still find value. Right. So that was how we find our target architecture. We've done that event storming, we've drawn all of our boundaries. So we've basically taken this problem space that we started with, this big box of difficult things, and we split it up into this domain, these 8 domains, sorry. So going back to Conway's law, so communication structure becomes architectural structure. Knowing that, and then knowing what our target architecture should be, what can we do with that to actually make use of this law? And the answer is we can use something called the reverse Conway manoeuvre. And this is something that was talked about in the Accelerate book. So Nicole Forsgren mentions this, and she recommends that as part of a DevOps maturity journey, you want to be evolving your organisation structure to achieve your desired architecture. So essentially we identify what our target architecture is, and then we make our teams look like that same architecture. Which sounds brilliant, and if we've got an unlimited number of teams, that's fantastic. So at Cinch, obviously, we just went and hired 7 more teams, and then that's to solve that problem. But the reality is, no, 8 into 1 doesn't really go. And this is the difficult part, isn't it? Because this theory is all brilliant, and we've figured out all these problems, but how do we actually then go and build it? And it's challenging. So it's like eating an elephant, like the old saying. You've got to start small and do little things. So don't try and reorganise yourselves. Don't try and solve this in one big hit. My advice in this situation, with one team and all these domains to look at, just start with one of the domains. Don't think, right, we need to figure out how to split this into 8 things. Let's start with the simplest, easiest one, the low-hanging fruit, and split that out. As a result of doing that, you'll find out whether this technique works for you, for starters. But you'll also end up with that little bit of the system is decoupled. So now when you've got to work on the big monolithic thing, at least it's only 7 things rather than 8. And you can start to work your way through it like that, a piece at a time. I'm definitely not saying that you need to do a reorg. A little bit of recent bitter experience, those people who've worked for Cinch will know. These are really painful, really, really expensive. So there's no need to do that. You can start small, just with one domain at a time. And now the important bit. So I said at the beginning about defending boundaries. for me, this is the most difficult part. Not because it requires any sort of skill or any knowledge, but it's difficult because it requires a bit of discipline, organisational discipline, as well as sort of personal discipline. Don't share domains. It's really bad. So if you share domains, remember Conway's law, we've taken this one problem space and given it to two people. I don't know what's going to happen there, but it ain't going to be good. You're going to end up with like two solutions to the problem, or a solution that's ripped in half. It's not going to work out very well. So absolutely do not share domains ever. Going back to Conway's law, communication structure becomes architecture structure. We need to represent those boundaries in our organisation as well as our architecture. So it's really key. But every day, and I mean every day, you'll have, can we just, like this team's got no work to do, and this team's like overwrought and like months behind. Can't this other team just help out? Well, maybe, but then we've built in a little bit of coupling there, haven't we? Because suddenly this team, who's nothing to do with that problem space, is now responsible for a little bit of that world. Or it's not worth setting up a new microservice for this. Let's just put it in this other place because we already own it and it's our problem space anyway. Like what happens when you decide actually another team needs to take that thing away? You can't because it's part of your shared code base. And all these little sort of hygiene factor things creep in and they build up and they build up. And I don't know, is it such a big deal? My experience, it is, and we've seen this, I think, at Cinch, and it's been quite painful. And it is a slippery slope, and you end up on a plane to nowhere, really, where you're continually waiting for other teams to finish work or other teams to give you domain expertise. You'll be pleased to know we're nearly there. So let's wrap up. Start off with understanding the space. So event storming is a brilliant tool to use, and it is a skill. So keep practicing it. Don't just give up because it was hard the first time, and don't obsess over getting it right the first time either. Things like, is this the right language to use or not? It's really difficult to move away from that, but it's okay to get it wrong because you'll learn the more that you do it. Organise around that target architecture. Defend those boundaries. And I think as a result, and I think I've seen this, you'll have happy people because you optimise for flow. And who actually wants to work around a process day in, day out? Who wants to have to battle the process? We just want to build things that people love, don't we? So if we're optimised for flow, we're going to do that and we're going to be happy about it. We're going to build things that customers actually want as well, because we're understanding this problem space so much better. Like we're really getting into the details of it. So we're actually going to build things that customers care about. It's also good for the business because we're going to be less tightly coupled. So if we want to completely drop a microservice and rebuild it, we can do that in a really small controlled way using one of these boundaries that we've established. If we wanted to rebuild part of the system using version 1 right back at the beginning when it was one big monolith, like that would have taken months. In fact, speaking from experience, about 9 months. So it's not good. So yeah, following these steps, it helps us build the right thing. It helps us build it quickly, hopefully. And that's it. That's the end. So, any questions?
Any tips for defending the boundaries?
Tips
You have just one team, because it's sort of like arguing with yourself.
Well, you've just got one team. I think it's just for me. It's about being aware. So I think you hear these conversations. I've certainly heard these conversations on a daily basis, and it's just always having in the back of your mind. Yeah, it would be easy, but what's the long-term impact? And always just keep coming back to that, almost like a mantra. Yeah.
I think you touched on some of this in the talk. The benefits I've seen from sort of domain-driven design sort of approaches so far have always been a little bit perspective. So it's kind of like a new project sort of coming up, and you start to kind of learn the domain and do that discovery that you're talking about there. What is there a kind of slightly different approach maybe in the case where that kind of modelling maybe has never sort of happened and the system already kind of exists? Like, is there ever a time where it's too late almost to kind of do that domain-driven sort of design modelling?
The point it's too late would be like this thing that we built and we're maintaining, it looks after itself and we don't spend any time on it and we don't want to improve it. I think at that point, what's the point in investing in it? If you're still working on something and trying to maintain it, then do you want to make it easier to maintain? Do you want to make it a better solution for your customers? I think if the answer to those things is yes, then use this technique. And as I say, you end up looking at a big problem space and you can identify the different parts of it, but just start with one. Just start trying to slice one bit out of the monolith, set that up in its own right, and look after that. And then that makes the monolith a lot easier to deal with. And it also means you can interact with that one service much easier as well. So yeah, I don't think it's too late unless you've given up on that bit of the product. James?
Do you think the team needed to go through let's create the first thing first in order to be able to discover those domains? They have to have that journey first.
Yeah, good question. I'd say no, you don't need to. For a particular product or particular solution, I don't think you need to. For your evolution as a professional, probably, because I think if you've only seen it done right, like we learn from mistakes, don't we? So you maybe don't value those lessons as you would do having seen it done really badly. Certainly, like everything I look back on, I don't think all the good things that I've seen. It's always the bad things, isn't it? I don't want to make that mistake again. So I think it's good for us to have gone through those difficult things as professionals. I think it helps to be well-rounded, doesn't it? But it's not a prerequisite, I wouldn't say.
I know you said obviously involve more than just engineers, but even your product owners can be quite close to the existing sort of issue. How do you sort of get into that mindset of properly breaking it down? I mean, is the process itself enough, or do you sort of have to really try to disassociate yourself from the sort of think as from a different perspective?
Yeah,
how do you sort of get into that mindset?
It's a good point. I think being kind to yourself and allowing yourself to make those mistakes, but also being honest enough to realise you've made them and keep reviewing and going back. I think it's a continual battle, is that, especially with something that is already built or you already understand the space to some extent, because what people will do is they will try and take the implementation and represent it as domain events, and that is a natural thing to do because obviously we go off our experience, but the reality is that isn't really a true reflection of what the domain looks like. So I think the technique I mentioned about always trying to think what your competitor would think of this, that's what I go to. So if I'm thinking this looks a little bit like implementation detail, like what would the competitor think of this? And if they would think, I don't know what that means, you've gone wrong. So, but you've just got to keep going back over it.
Yeah, to sort of put yourself in that sort of space where you would do in a retro race, kind of, it's okay to question the status quo.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the process doesn't save you from that. I think it's just being aware of it and just trying to hone the craft. Like I said, you get this wrong the first time, like it's guaranteed. You know, I got it wrong a lot of times before we ended up starting to see real value from it. But now that we are, I think it's just an awareness that you get from practice. Yeah.
On your diagram, where you've drawn circles, some of those circles seem to be really quite small with maybe only 3 or 4 events in. Do you ever find you've over-segregated?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that diagram, that's not like the right answer. And it probably didn't last a day actually. So that picture was taken probably a couple of hours before we finished. I'd almost guarantee that those shapes had changed before we actually ended that session, and then we go back to it later and it's changed again. So I think it's a continual evolution of your understanding of a problem space. So yeah, it's fine for those boundaries to change as long as it's changing for the right reason. In terms of, I mean, it's a good question about getting too small.
Yeah, because you're saying about picking things apart, but then there's that point of bringing things together.
Yeah, so what I'd say about that is, I briefly mentioned about domains and subdomains and that sort of hierarchical view. As long as the little tiny thing is still within its parent domain, I think it's fine to leave it there in that big block. So if you've got 2 or 3 tiny things that really aren't worth splitting out, as long as they're still part of the same domain family, that's fine because you're not crossing those boundaries. Where it would be an issue is if you said, well, we're just going to split half of this and give it to this other squad over here who are looking after this completely separate domain. That's where you start to see real challenges, I think.
What's the input to your event storming? So you try and capture the as is, or you're always expecting product owners, etc., to come with the future requirements, and you're kind of more hypothetical about what you want to build, or do you actually start with the current state?
I think the current state can lead you to just reflecting what you already think you know about the problem space. So it's very difficult to do this, but I'd always try and advise people to just start from scratch. Like, if you're coming at this brand new, what would this look like? And it's really helpful to have subject matter experts in there. So not necessarily product owners who need to research that, and BAs who need to research that problem space, but people from those departments in the business, or even external people who know a lot about the problem space that you're looking at, and try and exploit like top down from the domain point of view. As I said, if you can look at this through the eyes of one of your competitors and it's still be the same thing, you've probably got it right. But if you're looking at it from what did we already build, how does that translate, I think that can be challenging. So I would start from scratch. Yeah.
One quick one. How do you know, so you were saying before how, even within a few hours it might change, or the next day. At what point do you decide that's enough, I'll start doing something, or is there an end as such, or is there a point where you say, well, that's right, that's good enough right now, let's go for it?
Well, I think because you never are going to get to a point where you fully understand it, there's never a right or a wrong time. I think the more you do this, the more you'll get a well understood understanding of that domain. But you can't just keep doing this forever. So it's just a judgment call, really. I would say do as much as you can, but at some point you do have to start cutting code and building things, and that's absolutely fine. There's no finish point. You don't go, all right, we've done it now, that's solved, we've figured it all out. So it's fine to start while there's still question marks. I think that's okay. Building it will answer some of the unknowns as well, naturally, I think. Yeah.
Thanks very much. It was a very good presentation and very nice.
Thank you.
Just related to the previous gentleman's point, you've got continuous development going on, so when you've got other stakeholders coming in who might want to contribute their ideas of what domains might be, like you said, you want to push back on that. But what happens when you have business owners, business stakeholders who come in and they want to segment different domains further, or they want the domains to look like what they prefer it to look like in the future? Would you then break domains down or expand them?
That's a really interesting question. I've not really come across that where people are sort of arbitrarily, or maybe for their own understanding, trying to enforce boundaries where maybe you don't agree. It's a democratic process, I think. So it's really more about it's a shared understanding of what this thing is. So if there's one or more individuals who are trying to force the agenda on it, that sounds like that's going in the wrong direction to me. It should be a consensus, and if in doubt, leave the two things together. I would say, like to the point we were talking about before about over-segmenting things. I think if there's any doubt, leave things together. As you start building or as you do more event storming, you'll realise the truth of whether those things should be separated or not. Don't try and get straight to that end point immediately. It's fine just to leave things and then come back to it maybe a few weeks or months down the line when your understanding has improved a bit. Yeah.
So actually that raises a point about documentation. So is there a way of somebody coming at the end of a process obviously is going to question how you ended up there? Is there, apart from lots of pictures, is there a way to document it, or is it really, if you're not involved in the process, it's very difficult to understand how you got there?
A lot of the value is in doing it rather than like the picture that you have at the end. So I think it is difficult to come to it after the fact and understand it. That being said, if we go all the way back to the mirror that I had up before, I think there's a lot of value in that picture. So there we go, this one. So even if you weren't involved in the process, you can come to this, and because we've got the logic indicated in these big things, we've got our events on there, you can still get a lot of value from this. I personally I'm quite a visual person. I don't really see the value in trying to write this down in a document. I think that is much more powerful as it is than it would be if you tried to document it in text. everyone's different, they consume information differently, but for me, that's a perfectly good point to leave it. The other advantage of this is that if we want to come back to this, like we've done a lot of work and we've realised we made some mistakes, let's do this process again. We've got this to refer to, we can just move things around again. So,
Measure mirror there. Like, is this kind of thing better in person or virtually?
well, ordinarily I say any sort of workshop like this is better in person, but there's a weird thing that happens with post-it notes. People are so scared to throw them away that you'll end up with like a board like this full of notes, and you'll have 10 things that have the same thing written on them, and they'll just stay there. No one's kind of brave enough to start taking them down.
It's hard to leave them around and have arrows and stuff like
Yeah, it is. Whereas in Miro, people are much more happy to recycle the post-it notes, which is sort of ironic, isn't it? But yeah, I've had good experiences doing it both ways, to be honest. So.
Just as an exercise with it, I've run one of these before, and early on I got everybody to deliberately tear up their post-it notes that they've got, just to get them into the process. It's a barrier you can work through.
Yeah. Cool.
Back to the politics, what happens, or have you experienced where some domains are more interesting and exciting for the actual underlying work than other areas which may be more procedural and routine sort of thing? So where an element where the product is innovating, for example, and another area where it's just simple integration kind of work?
Yeah, absolutely. I find that it's quite often the things that you take for granted as being simple that actually end up being more interesting to work through, because one of the exciting things about doing this is that you realise a lot of the assumptions you had are nonsense. So as you start to work through those assumptions and tease them out and build your understanding, I think that's a really interesting process. And more often than not, it's with the simple things that seem dead easy and everyone's on the same page, right, we don't need to do this. And actually you start into it and everyone's got a completely different idea of what's going on in here. So yeah, it depends, I guess, on everyone personally, what they're interested in or not, but I've never done one of these sessions and thought that was a bit boring and a bit like, I expected that to happen exactly the way it did. It always brings up something new and interesting.
Yes, I was more thinking about the output and then the eventual work that gets delegated. So if you're assigning particular teams to particular domains, for example, if there's a potential for some domains to be where people want to work, whereas others they don't want to work on, for example.
Yeah, assigning the work out, it's a different area really. Is that I was intending, as it said on the blog, I was intending to talk a bit about team topologies until I realised that we've been here all night and bored you to death. Team topologies is a really, I think, a good way of reasoning around how to assign work out. For me, because of what team topology says about breaking up customer journeys, you should never have, for instance, a team that looks after this bit and then somebody else looks after the next bit and then the first team looks after the bit after that. Having that break, it causes a lot of cognitive load problems because it's really difficult to reason about where that break is. So I would always try and group the domains around their siblings within a team. In terms of the politics around people being given domains that they don't want, I don't know if I've got any good advice for you there, to be honest. That's just fact of life, isn't it, sometimes? Okay.
Sorry to jump in, I'm just mindful of time, that's all. Some great questions. Hopefully Greg's going to stick around.